There are places people fight to visit. And then there is Poveglia, a tiny island sitting in the Venetian Lagoon, surrounded by some of the most beautiful water in Europe. Yet for decades, ordinary visitors were kept away. Not because the island was too far, not because it was inaccessible, but because Poveglia had become something far more complicated. A place where Venice once sent people it could not afford to keep close. The sick, the dying, the unwanted, and eventually the abandoned. Poveglia is often called one of the most haunted places on Earth. Stories claim that its soil is filled with the remains of plague victims, that patients were tortured inside its hospital, that a doctor performed horrific experiments, that voices still echo through the empty buildings. But here is where the story gets darker. Much of what you have heard about Poveglia is legend, and the truth does not need ghosts to be frightening, because the real reason Poveglia became forbidden has less to do with the supernatural, and far more to do with what human beings actually did there. And even today, the island's future remains a battle between preservation, tourism, and memory. This is the darker page of Poveglia. Poveglia is small, only around 7 hectares, but its location made it strategically important. For centuries, the Venetian Lagoon was not simply beautiful. It was a defensive system, a maze of islands and waterways protecting one of Europe's most powerful cities. Poveglia itself had been inhabited and fortified long before its reputation for death. But eventually Venice found a darker use for it: isolation. When disease threatened the city, authorities needed somewhere to send people away from the population. Somewhere distant, somewhere contained, somewhere where an outbreak could be stopped before it reached Venice. And Poveglia was perfectly positioned. The island became associated with quarantine and the management of infectious disease. The principle was brutally simple: separate the suspected sick from the healthy. Keep them away. Wait, and hope. For the people sent there, however, quarantine could mean something very different. Could mean being separated from your family, your home, your entire life. And for some, there would be no return. The plague transformed Poveglia's reputation. Venice experienced repeated outbreaks over the centuries, and islands in the lagoon became part of the city's elaborate system for controlling disease. Poveglia was one of those places. Imagine Venice at the height of an epidemic. No antibiotics, no modern epidemiology, no understanding of bacteria or viruses, only fear. And fear creates brutal decisions. People showing symptoms could be isolated. Ships could be detained. Cargo could be inspected. The dead had to be removed, and the living had to be separated from them. Poveglia became part of this machinery of containment. Over time, the island acquired a reputation that would become almost impossible to escape. A place associated with sickness, death, and separation. But this is where we need to separate history from mythology. You will often hear the claim that 160,000 plague victims were buried or burned on Poveglia. You will also hear that more than half the island's soil is human ash. Those numbers are widely repeated, but they are not established historical facts. The documented history is disturbing enough without inventing statistics, because the island really was used for quarantine, and because people really did die there. That distinction matters. The darkest stories are sometimes the ones we are tempted to exaggerate. Eventually, the great epidemics passed. But Poveglia did not simply become a peaceful paradise. Its connection to health control continued. By the late 18th century, the island was under the authority of Venice's health administration. Ships entering the lagoon could be inspected. Disease control remained the priority. Poveglia was no longer simply an island. It was infrastructure, a physical barrier between Venice and the diseases threatening it. And then came another transformation, one that would create the second great chapter of Poveglia's dark reputation: the hospital. In the 20th century, Poveglia's buildings were used for institutional healthcare. A long-term care facility operated there, and later the island became associated with psychiatric care. This is where the modern legend of Poveglia becomes almost impossible to separate from reality. Stories began circulating about a cruel doctor, a man supposedly obsessed with experimentation, a man who allegedly performed primitive brain operations on patients, a man who eventually became so disturbed by what he had done that he threw himself from the island's bell tower. It is an incredible story, and it is also one of the stories that needs a warning label. There is no solid historical evidence establishing the famous tale in the form in which it is usually repeated online. The supposed doctor, the torture, the supernatural voices, the dramatic suicide. Much of this belongs to modern Poveglia folklore. The local tourism organization itself notes that many of the island's famous ghost stories are relatively recent and were popularized by paranormal television rather than ancient Venetian tradition. And that distinction changes the story, because the truth is actually more haunting. Poveglia did not need a mad doctor. It did not need ghosts. It already represented something deeply human. The isolation of people's society did not know how to care for. By the late 1960s, the institution on Poveglia had closed. The island was abandoned. And then something strange happened. Nature began taking it back. Buildings deteriorated. Roofs weakened. Walls cracked. The vegetation thickened. The island slowly stopped looking like a place designed for human beings. It began looking like a place humans had forgotten. Poveglia's documented institutional history ended. But its mythology was just beginning. The internet discovered Poveglia. Then television discovered it. Then paranormal tourism discovered it. Suddenly, the island was being marketed as an island of ghosts. The dead were said to walk its corridors. Invisible voices were supposedly heard. The bell tower became central to stories of supernatural punishment. And Poveglia acquired a nickname that was almost impossible to escape: the Island of Ghosts. But there is a fascinating contradiction here. According to local historical sources, there is little evidence that these famous ghost legends were part of traditional Venetian folklore. They are comparatively recent, which means the most famous version of Poveglia's story was not necessarily created by the people who lived around it. It was created by the people who came looking for a horror story. And that raises a disturbing question. What happens when tragedy becomes entertainment? This is where the title needs a little clarification. Poveglia is often described online as permanently closed to everyone. But that is not entirely accurate. The reality is more complicated. The island has been largely off-limits to ordinary tourist access because of its abandoned structures, safety concerns, preservation issues, and its status as a publicly controlled historic site. But that does not mean nobody can ever set foot on Poveglia. In recent years, its future has actually become a political and community battle. In 2014, Italy's state property agency attempted to find a long-term private use for the island. That triggered resistance. A Venetian community organization called Poveglia per Tutti, Poveglia for Everyone, emerged around the idea that the island should not simply become another luxury development. Poveglia per Tutti. Their vision was radically different. Not a luxury hotel. Not a paranormal theme park. Not another attraction for mass tourism. But a protected public space. And that matters because Venice has another problem. Tourism. Millions of visitors pour through the city. The streets become crowded. Its historic spaces become commercialized. And locals increasingly fight over what should remain theirs. Poveglia became part of that larger struggle. For decades, Poveglia was simply abandoned. But abandonment does not mean ownership disappears. Someone still has to decide what happens next. In 2014, the Italian government sought a long-term lease for the island. The effort failed. Then local activists organized. They raised money. They challenged privatization. And eventually, after years of legal and administrative battles, Poveglia Pertuti secured a 6-year concession for the northern section of the island in 2025, with plans focused on conservation and public use. So the story has taken an unexpected turn. The island once used to keep people away from Venice is now being reclaimed by Venetians themselves, not as a haunted attraction, but as a place to preserve, a place to remember, a place where nature can return. There is something almost seductive about the ghost story. A mad doctor, a cursed bell tower, thousands upon thousands of restless dead. It gives Poveglia a clean narrative, a beginning, a monster, curse. But history rarely works that way. The real Poveglia is more uncomfortable. It tells us about governments trying to contain disease, about families separated by fear, about institutions built to isolate vulnerable people, about buildings that eventually became too expensive or unnecessary to maintain, and about modern society turning historical suffering into entertainment. The island's darkness is not supernatural. It is human, and perhaps that is why Poveglia remains so powerful. Because when you stand across the water and look toward those abandoned buildings, you are not looking at a haunted house. You are looking at the physical remains of decisions people once made. Decisions made when they were afraid. Decisions made when someone had to be sacrificed for the greater good. Decisions about who would be isolated and who would be protected. Poveglia was never simply an island of death. It was an island of separation. For centuries, Venice used distance as a weapon against things it feared. Disease, disorder, uncertainty, and eventually the island itself became something people feared. But perhaps the greatest irony is this: the ghosts that made Poveglia famous may never have existed. The suffering that created its reputation did. Today, Poveglia's future is no longer simply about keeping tourists away. It is about deciding what should happen to a place carrying centuries of memory. Should it become a tourist attraction? A luxury development? A protected sanctuary? Or should some places remain quiet because their history deserves silence? Because perhaps the darkest thing about Poveglia is not what might be haunting the island. It is what the island remembers about us. That when humanity becomes afraid enough, we build walls, we create distance, we isolate the vulnerable. And sometimes we convince ourselves that forgetting them is the same thing as saving everyone else. So the next time you hear the legend of the haunted island outside Venice, look past the ghosts, look past the numbers, look past the sensational stories, and turn the page. Because sometimes, the darker page of history is the one where there are no monsters at all.